So I've spent much of my political career being called a moderate for criticizing progressives for not looking at the big picture and realizing that we need to elect the Democrats or things can get much worse. And I've even made a video to that point, which I'll link to up here. How things have changed. What is the problem with those moderates in Congress? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So we have a true moderate in the White House. He wasn't my first choice. Elizabeth Warren was. And Kamala Harris wasn't my first choice for vice president. I was hoping for Stacey Abrams. Nevertheless, I'm a big believer in the idea that we as Democrats need to come together under a big tent and work as a unified group to push as much progress as is possible under the circumstances. In such a large and diverse country as the United States, it's difficult to get everybody on the same page. And even though it seems obvious to me that the goals of the progressives just make sense, and the arguments of the conservatives, if they're not hypocritical, they're just based on flawed logic or incorrect information. So the goal should always be to try to push the most progressive agenda possible. Well, I've been pleasantly surprised with a lot of the actions that this administration has taken. While I do wish that he were pushing more strongly for a wealth tax, for structural change at the Supreme Court, or for a Medicare expansion, his COVID relief bill was absolutely one of the best pieces of legislation to pass Congress since Obamacare. And his Build Back Better agenda that is currently winding its way through Congress, hopefully to be passed through the reconciliation process in the Senate, is perhaps the most important piece of economic legislation since the 1960s. But it approaches these problems from a very moderate perspective. I mean, we're not talking again, a wealth tax. We're not talking about even returning the taxes on high income even to anything near what they were in the 1980s. But addressing our infrastructure needs, making progress on addressing the climate crisis, free community college and pre-K, these are the types of things that will make a fundamental difference in people's lives. And they do so while placing a relatively light burden on the wealthy. Yes, they have to pay a little bit more under this plan, but not anywhere near as much as myself and other progressives would like to see. So what is the deal with these moderates in Congress who are scuttling things? I mean, one of the most important parts of this bill and one of the most popular pieces of President Biden's agenda was the idea that Medicare and Medicaid would negotiate directly with drug makers to try to reduce drug costs. As we know, the United States spends far more on prescription costs than anywhere else in the world. And while it does help encourage innovation, more than anything what it's done is encourage the drug makers to spend a lot of money on high salaries and stock buybacks, as well as focusing on blockbuster drugs rather than some less profitable programs that might actually make a big difference in people's lives. But with our high drug prices, we basically subsidize low drug prices in the rest of the world. And nobody's saying that drug makers should not be able to make some profit. Just at a certain point, it gets ridiculous. So a market-based solution appears to be one where the federal government, which is the largest buyer of prescription drugs in the country, is able to negotiate lower prices that will benefit everybody. This is something that is wildly popular across virtually every political stripe, and it's actually something that would reduce inflation without really any additional cost to the federal government, both things that have been raised as concerns by the moderates. So what have these moderates done? Well, they've scuttled it. Their justifications make no sense. I think the clearest explanation of what's going on here is that the pharmaceutical lobby has flexed its muscles. But that's not being a moderate, that's just being a sellout. Let's also talk about this debate over the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better bill. One of President Biden's pledges from the beginning is that it would be fully paid for by taxes on the wealthy, who can certainly afford to pay more. Both the House and the Senate have passed plans through their committees that would pay $2.9 trillion of the cost or more. And you have to remember this $3.5 trillion that's proposed is over 10 years. It's not over 1 year. So as a percentage of our gross domestic product, it's actually pretty small. But the argument of some of these moderates is that the $3.5 trillion figure is too high. They don't say what figure is right. It could be 3.4 trillion. It could be 3.3 trillion. It could be 2 trillion. It could be 2.9 trillion. Who knows? It's purely an arbitrary number at this point. They argue that this amount of spending will drive up inflation, but as I pointed out, it's a relatively small percentage of GDP when calculated over the full 10 years. And recent news on inflation has actually shown that inflation is slowing, and I'll post a link to that video up here. And again, every single piece of this bill is wildly popular with the public. So what is the deal with them? I think these moderates feel they need to show their constituents, many of whom represent districts that are totally unlike the one that AOC represents in New York City. Ones where they stand a legitimate chance of being defeated by a Republican. Representatives from those districts need to show that they are not lock, stock, and barrel with the Democrats' national agenda. Well, that's fine. Make all the noise you want, but at a certain point, don't scuttle the things that are actually going to make a difference in people's lives. I mean, at a certain point, if you don't support things like improving the lives of working people, or reducing poverty, or reducing drug prices, it makes you wonder why you're a Democrat in the first place. Too much is at stake right now. Democrats need to come together and support this agenda. And I would argue also support the agenda that will protect voting rights. In particular, the legislation that Senator Manchin and Senator Klobuchar have helped negotiate. These are moderate policies which should appeal to everybody and will provide a deep well of appreciation to the Democratic Party as a whole, including to these moderate congressmen who are going to have to be able to go back to their districts and trumpet something that they delivered for the people of their district. To be able to point to some of the items in this agenda that directly impact the pocketbooks of people throughout their districts is something that's going to be a strong argument for their reelection, especially in light of the fact that the Republicans are doing their level best to tear it down. Just think how popular the Obamacare ultimately became and how important it was for the Democrats to use as a message against Republicans in 2018. Obamacare, though, took a while for people to be able to start to see the benefits from. Not so with the dependent child tax credit, which goes directly into people's pockets every month. That's something that Democrats will be able to point to if they pass this legislation and credibly make the claim that Republicans will take it away from you if they elect them. That is a potent message both for progressives and for moderates. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, that'd be a huge help. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.